this morning we're going to be looking at regional approaches to disaster risk reduction in Asia Pacific. I think we can see this as a phenomenon that is really growing in importance and growing in strength, both across South Asia, Asia, and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And we're going to be hearing some reflections from our lovely gentlemen this morning. So without further ado, Ibnu, I think you're going to be up in the hot seat first. So inviting you to come and present your work on Can the ASEAN Way Adapt, Preventing Transboundary Haze Pollution in Southeast Asia through Regional Cooperation. Thank you.
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Ibnu Sitompul, a member of the lead group here at University of Canterbury. And today I'm going to give a brief presentation about the article that John and I have been working on, which is looking at the possibility of the ASEAN Way principle to adapt, particularly when it comes to preventing transboundary haze pollution and as an impact of forest fire in Southeast Asia. Oh, so this okay. So last night, no, it's okay. So before I start, last night at the dinner, I have a friend told me that I can do my PowerPoint presentation this morning, work on it this morning, and you'll have there will be a brilliant idea will come up, right? So this is it. See, this is a good idea. The initial plan is to just that's the plan. No, it's okay. The initial plan is to just watch the documentary on climate change and skip to the forest fire part. And but then I'm just gonna go to the normal, traditional, boring slides. Okay. But that's a good idea. That's from him. So the article that we're working on. We argue that the ASEAN Way approach to the management of hazard, in this case forest fire, and its consequences has not been effective, right? And perhaps raises a question about the limits of regional approaches to hazard and disaster management, as well as raising fundamental issues about ASEAN Way itself for managing future disasters in Southeast Asian region. So to give a bit of background, forest fire and transboundary haze pollution occurs annually in this region. Most of them occurs in Indonesia, particularly in the island of Sumatra and Borneo. And the haze pollution impact not only felt in Indonesia, but also neighboring countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and for some cases as far as Thailand. So there are three main causes of forest fire in this region. Which includes the slash and burn method of land clearing, illegal logging, and land expansion for palm oil plantation. So Indonesia is the world's largest producer of palm oil, accounting for 59% of the global production. So palm oil plantation is really important for the country's economy. So we have to note that. Okay. So forest fire and haze pollution have many impact to these countries, including impact to their economy, people's health, as well as environment and biodiversity. Yeah, in 1997, for example, the forest fire and haze pollution impacted the health of 75 million people, including 20 million in Indonesia. From the same event, Singapore recorded economic losses between 160 to 280 million US dollar per day, primarily from health and tourism sector. The air quality index in some part of Sumatra and Borneo reached the maximum level of 999, which is more than 3 times the amount considered as hazardous. And it lasted for weeks. For weeks and sometimes for months. Other sectors such as trade and education also impacted, as government was forced to close down schools and various international trades have to stop. Not to mention the impact to nearby villages. They don't have electricity for weeks, and so their source of water like river and lakes are polluted. So now, are there any effort at the regional level to prevent this event from happening again and again? And are those efforts sufficient? Are they effective? And at the regional level in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN has established the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, or the Haze Agreement, in 2002, with the main goal to prevent and monitor transboundary haze pollution as a result of forest and land fire, which could be mitigated. That's the objective of the agreement. And the agreement has been ratified by all 10 ASEAN member states. And to support the effectiveness of this agreement, ASEAN have adopted a number of instruments, including the implementation roadmap and all these initiatives. But okay. But since 2002 until today, forest fires still reoccurring in Indonesia, and haze pollution still impacted neighboring country, especially in the dry season. Yeah. In fact, in the last year forest fire in 2003 in Indonesia is one of the biggest in the last 5 years, with almost 1.2 million hectares of forest was burned, and this shows that all those regional efforts have not been effective. So our article argues that the ASEAN Way is one of the primary causes of this ineffectiveness. So what is the ASEAN Way? The ASEAN Way, I mean. So yeah. So the ASEAN Way is the fundamental principle that guides ASEAN member states in their relationship and cooperation in all sectors. Yeah. So the ASEAN Way principle is always utilized in political, cultural, economic, and legal context. Based on the ASEAN Way, relationship between ASEAN member states is based on a domestic social procedure rather than the domestic political procedure of the normative communities of liberal democracies. This means that cooperation between ASEAN member states, any practices, any declarations, is based on a common culture. Yeah. As a result, the Southeast Asian culture is of consultation and consensus. A conflict avoidance principle is used in vast majority of dispute resolution processes, as well as decision-making process. 3 minutes. Okay. Okay. The ASEAN Way has been effectively used to unite the region post-World War II, maintain peace in the region after the Cold War, and even though this region consists of countries that are different, very different in their political view, culture, religion, race, etc., but the ASEAN Way soft approach has a big success in addressing these differences and make ASEAN an effective regional bloc, second only to the EU in regional cooperation across the number of fields, including disaster risk reduction. But in terms of preventing forest fire and haze pollution, ASEAN Way, particularly the three principles of the principles of sovereignty, non-intervention, and peaceful dispute settlement, has had negative impact. It has directly weakened various key obligations in ASEAN agreement, including, these are some of the examples, including the absence of compliance mechanism in the agreement. There are a number of mechanisms which could be classified as a tool to encourage state compliance within environmental and DRR treaty obligation. This tool could include processes for the assessment of the fact concerning the attainment of the agreement objective, a non-compliance procedure, and so on. But the Haze Agreement lacks any of these elements. So basically, the Haze Agreement is in line with the spirit of the ASEAN Way, putting forward cooperative measures in preventing forest fire without regulating specific prescription to promote compliance or place any consequences for non-compliance. So as a consequence, the Haze Agreement places the burden of compliance entirely on member states, which is, which it is argued insufficient. So I'm just gonna, one more. Okay. So another impact of the ASEAN Way is of the ASEAN Way to the Haze Agreement can be seen in the adoption of a weak dispute settlement mechanism. So Article 27 says, any dispute between parties as to the interpretation or application or compliance with this agreement or any protocol thereto shall be settled amicably by consultation and negotiation. So there is no route that can be taken by parties, especially including the impacted party like Malaysia or Singapore, to ask Indonesia as the state from where the hazard comes to bear responsibility for the alleged violation of international obligation under this agreement. So government officials, especially impacted countries like Malaysia and Singapore, cannot freely express and bring up their sentiment about this issue to the international community, including the UN, as it will be considered as interfering with other members' internal affairs. Okay. As a result, no, is it? Okay. And okay. So the article, I'm just gonna go skip through conclusion. The article is looking for whether the ASEAN Way can adapt when it comes to effort to prevent forest fire and transboundary haze pollution issue in the region. And the principle of non-interference and peaceful means to settle disputes should only be used when it comes to political and cultural matter. When the issue is predominantly legal and has transboundary legal consequences regionally and globally, the ASEAN Way should be set aside, not entirely, but to some degree. And there are evidence for this. For example, the dispute between Indonesia and Malaysia regarding the territorial claim of Sipadan and Digitan Island, which was resolved in the ICJ in 2002. So there are ways to set aside the ASEAN Way. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we've been into Southeast Asia and now we're going to be traveling down into the Pacific. And very pleased to have with us Mr. Pratish Raj, who is just started his PhD, I'm told only a couple of weeks ago. So he's a brave man. And he's going to be talking to us about the foundation of an effective disaster risk management system, looking at the assessment of the Fijian legal framework.
Bulavinaka, namaste, and kia ora. I think there's no better way to start your PhD with a presentation in the first month. So thanks for pushing me to do it, John. I will be presenting on some of the key findings from a project that I conducted as a precursor to my PhD in disaster law. The IFRC's 2024 Disaster Risk Governance Guidelines consolidates research and recommendations on disaster risks governance into a single document, which offers guidance on building a robust DRM framework. As part of the summer project, I tried to benchmark the Fijian DRM laws to the newly consolidated guidelines. In Fiji, following the tropical cyclone Winston, there was a lot of momentum built up on amending the Fijian DRM laws. And Fiji is actually currently in the process of amending its bill, and it is very highly likely that it is going to get passed in Parliament. Coincidentally, the bill was tabled in Parliament on the very day I submitted my project report. So I think they were anticipating heavy criticism, so maybe they just amended it. No, I think it's mostly to do with the help of IFRC and the stakeholders and other stakeholders. And the bill generally is aligned to the consolidated guidelines in terms of having an effective foundation for DRM management. And some of the key observations from the project were the underutilization of localized disaster risk reduction strategies and the involvement of people at the grassroots level. And I think we've been having quite a bit of discussion over the past 2 days on this issue. So my presentation focuses on the importance of localized disaster risk reduction in the Fijian context. Given Fiji's demographic, there appears to be limited emphasis on localized disaster risk reduction strategies in Fiji's disaster management framework. And research on localized DRR governance has indicated that international instruments alone do not empower communities to have an effective DRN system in place. And communities are communities are usually at the forefront when it comes to responding to disasters. But I think stakeholders over the years have realized that communities are just as important in reducing disaster risk as they are important in disaster response. While Fiji's national management plan does not incorporate the use of any indigenous and local knowledge, its 2018-2030 policy does acknowledge the benefits they could offer in DRR. The policy highlights, in fact, if I'm correct, the policy only has one example, and it highlights the building techniques that were used in building traditional bures in Fiji. It uses it as an example in its policy. The new Fiji Disaster Risk Management Bill provides for the establishment of divisional DRM offices. This is something new that did not exist in the previous DRM laws. And so what it does is it's basically like a branch to the national NDMO. And ideally, this could help enhance grassroots engagement. As most of the DRR training for relevant stakeholders is conducted at the national level, there seems to be a disconnect of in terms of what happens at the national, municipal, and local level. So hopefully decentralization of these NDMO offices would help engage grassroots people. It could also help streamline DRR management plans, which could help bridge this gap. And as the proximity of these offices could help in better coordination and capacity building at the community level. However, while community-based approaches is widely accepted in DRR, literature also argues that such initiatives should also consider the power imbalances that exist within the communities, where local elites often determine priority consents for that particular community. In the Fijian context, it is also recommended that localized DRR strategies consider the traditional hierarchical structures that exist within the communities to ensure that there is an essence of an all of society approach. While the new law mandates community engagement, it is crucial to ensure that these laws are not just on paper and are applied in practice as well. Perhaps the subnational, this is something that I picked up. I was reflecting on my time working in the banking industry in Fiji, where we used to have compliance registers and regular audits by the Reserve Bank. So perhaps I was thinking maybe perhaps the subnational offices could facilitate some type of audit within these various communities. But it should not be like a top-down approach. The subnational officers should not be dictating what the community should be doing, but instead engage with the community and let them determine how they would like to be checked upon, so to say, and on the frequency and the mode for those updates. With the ultimate aim, of course, being to reinforce the awareness. Because what happens is, even though sometimes stakeholders involve the communities, after a few months, communities tend to forget, and it is quite natural. We also forget things. And another significant element of community-based DRR is the use of local and indigenous knowledge. A study conducted in Fiji in 2016 on traditional oral narratives in mitigating the impacts of climate change argued that traditional knowledge and practice still have relevance despite the vastly different environmental landscape that we now live in. They provide practical means to cope with environmental changes, emphasizing their place and relevance in developing future resilience strategies. However, in the Fijian context, and perhaps the Pacific generally, studies have also attributed strong communal bonds to accumulating knowledge and capital in localized DRR, which cannot be assumed for all communities, especially in the Fijian context where there is a large Indo-Fijian population who do not necessarily follow the same communal structures that exist within the indigenous population. In Fiji's demographic DRR frameworks should be inclusive to cater for the needs and realities of all ethnic groups, and perhaps consider the transferability of indigenous knowledge to other non-indigenous groups. I think generally Fiji has done an excellent job in enacting a comprehensive DRM legal framework, but without a holistic involvement at the community level, the new law will certainly become a law on paper only, which does tend to happen quite a lot in the Pacific region, because you have all these laws enacted simply to tick a box, but then when it comes to the implementation, there's a big question mark. And before I take my seat, because Holly's looking at me, so, no, I'm almost done. Before I take my seat, I want to leave you with a quote from the former Prime Minister of Fiji, Mr. Frank Bainimarama. And the reason I've chosen the former Prime Minister is because I think the previous government was really at the forefront of getting the discussion going on amending the laws. But it is the current government that's actually doing it now. And the reason I've chosen the former Prime Minister is because disasters have a way of bringing not only people together, but politicians as well, just to help prepare the country, better prepare and respond to disasters. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think a very timely piece of research you're embarking on, and even though the bill is, almost ready to be passed, I think the findings from this will be really useful in terms of its implementation, where you're talking about compliance, decentralization, the implementation. So now we've had kind of like a focused look at what's happening at one country in the Pacific and how they're applying some of these issues into their own legal frameworks. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit, and we're going to be looking at the approaches in the Pacific region as a whole. And we're delighted to have Mr. Exsley Tloiburi. Do I owe you the wine, or did I get it right? Oh, there you go. Okay. So Exsley is going to be speaking to us today on some of the work that's happened in the Pacific around strengthening regional approaches to disaster risk reduction and climate change, and also talking a little bit about the future direction as well. So for those who don't know, Exsley is the Deputy Director of the Disaster and Community Resilience Program for the Pacific community. He took up that role, I think it was sometime last year, Exsley, but before that is no stranger to the Pacific, having worked with the Pacific Island Forum also for many years. So over to you, Exsley.
Thank you very much, Gabby, and very good morning to all of you. My task is made a bit more easier because we've already had the presentation of an experience on the situation in the ASEAN region, and also hearing from the national context of one of the countries in the Pacific. So I will zoom out a bit and focus at the regional level. And I have decided to structure my intervention this morning in the form of a SITREP, a situation report. So looking back a bit where we are now and looking ahead. So I'll use the next 10 minutes to do justice by providing that information. I hope that will be useful for some of you that are keen to learn a bit more about what we do in the region and at the regional level in the Pacific. So I'll look back prior to 2015. In the Pacific, we did have separate regional frameworks for the UNFCCC process, which is the climate change mechanism at the international level, and also the UNDRR process, which now is guided by the Sendai framework. So in the Pacific, prior to that, we had what we call the Pacific Regional Disaster Risk Management Framework for Action, and a separate one for climate change practitioners that was known as the Pacific Islands Framework for Action on Climate Change. So those were two separate frameworks prior to 2015. At that time, a lot of decisions and those that were usually brought to the table to have dialogue and make decisions on regional priorities were primarily government officials and government representatives. There was very little space in regional decision making for other stakeholders, including academia, the private sector, civil society organizations, and partners. That was a situation that we had in those years before 2015. Where we are now, the current situation since 2016 up until now, the region has progressed with a global first approach by developing an integrated regional policy framework that brings together climate change and disaster into one single framework that's known as the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific 2016 to 2030. And that has inspired follow-up discussions, including in Asia and also in Africa, on how to explore potential opportunities like what the Pacific is pioneering with the FRDP. And that came about because our region saw the leadership that was already happening at the national level. We have countries like Tonga, that's one of the pioneers with what they call the Joint National Action Plan, that's already integrating climate change and DRM into a single Joint National Action Plan. We have countries like Kiribati with what they call the the KJIP, Kiribati Joint Implementation Plan, that also brings together climate change and DRM into a single policy framework at the national level. With the FRDP, we have a multi-stakeholder mechanism that brings all stakeholders to the table through what we call the Pacific Resilience Partnership. And through the PRP governance arrangement, we have different entry points for stakeholders to engage. And one is through technical working groups. We have about 8 technical working groups under the PRP. One engages on disaster risk governance. And during the COVID period, that technical working group brought together representatives from Attorney General's offices to review and look at the legislations that countries in the Pacific have at that stage. And that was something that through that technical working group, bringing together legislators around the Pacific to discuss issues that are important in responding to COVID. As I mean, at the moment, a lot of our countries are now moving and exploring, expanding the scope of their national DRM legislation and plans to include pandemics as well. So that was a discussion that was initiated through one of those technical working groups. We also have the PRP task force. This is the governance apex of the PRP, which brings together the different stakeholders through a 15 membership arrangement. And in that 15, only 5 of those 15 are from governments. Another 5 is from CSOs and private sector, and another 5 from partners, which also has a dedicated seat for academia. The UN, crop agencies, which is what SPC is part of, that's the Council of Regional Organizations in the Pacific, and also one for multilateral development banks. So through that mechanism, you now have an arrangement that different stakeholders are now around the table to have discussions and make decisions on things that are important to the Pacific. Every 2 years, we convene a biennial Pacific Resilience meeting. The last one was in October last year. That was the 3rd biennial PRM since 2019. And that's a platform that brings together different stakeholders, including youth, community representatives, to showcase success stories, to share experiences, lessons learned, and also looking at what is happening in other regions. And the next one will be happening in the next 2 years. And that's one other entry point that's also available through this mechanism. And of course, every year, our Pacific Island Forum leaders, which is the meeting of the presidents and prime ministers of the Pacific, ask for an annual progress report that we provide to them every year. So the work of the PRP in implementing the FRDP often feeds up to the highest level of decision making at the political level in the Pacific through the Pacific Island Forum leaders meeting. In terms of what SPC is doing, we have also started to convene the inaugural Pacific DRR Ministers meeting since September 2022. This is a meeting that is expected to take place every 2 years, and that is supported by an annual meeting of the NDMO directors, or the Pacific Regional Disaster Managers meeting. At the long-term policy level in the Pacific is the 2050 strategy that I talked about on day one. And for the first time, we now have climate change and disaster being pulled together as one single thematic priority under that strategy. And there are only 7 priorities for the Pacific within that strategy. And having that as one thematic priority now encourages all countries and partners to ensure that we track and provide single reporting against one thematic priority, bringing together climate change and DRR stakeholders. Last year, our leaders also endorsed a dedicated framework for climate mobility, which at the moment, we are now in the process of developing the implementation plan. Looking ahead, the Pacific Ministerial Meeting, as I mentioned, that's the DRR Ministers Meeting, now have a formal terms of reference as of this year. And that meeting will take place every 2 years. The next meeting, the second meeting, will be in early 2025. That's an opportunity and entry point for outcomes of discussions like this to feed into those kinds of meetings. We also now need to ensure that the spirit of integration, integrating climate change and DRM, is maintained. At the moment, there have been some recent lessons learned from a midterm review done recently for the FRDP, aligned to the midterm review of the Sendai framework, which took place last year. And we need to make the FRDP more relevant to our countries and partners so that there is stronger buy-in. And that's a good lesson learned for us, so that we avoid fragmentation and backsliding from where we are now. We also must ensure that reporting through the 2050 strategy on climate change and disaster is balanced, and not to ensure that, and not to reach a stage that climate change reporting dominates that reporting section under the 2050 strategy. We are also working on the development of a new Pacific regional humanitarian response coordination mechanism. At the moment, this is something that we are working on for approval in 2025 when our PIF leaders have their meeting. And this is something that SPC is also working closely on in driving that process, along with partners such as UNDRR, IFRC, and others through a technical working group. And I think this is a space that provides an opportunity to look at learnings from ASEAN and the AHA Center, for instance, how we can ensure there's improved collaboration. This year as well, we are going to bring to our forum leaders meeting the endorsement of a new high-level political champion for disaster risk management. That's for the first time. In Africa, they do have a dedicated DRM champion. The Pacific, we have 8 for climate change, none for DRM. We are going to have one in the leaders meeting this year that would help all of us to elevate this work going forward. And of course, building on IFRC's work in doing legislative reviews for the region, we are doing an update report as well in mapping DRM legislations and policies in our region. That's work in progress, and we look forward to getting input from some of you that are in this room. So I think in conclusion, I would say that what we've heard today is that there is an ASEAN way. We also have a Pacific way, and that's a narrative that has been there for a long time. But I think what is missing right now is how you bring together the ASEAN and the Pacific way together through more exchanges, through more collaboration, more information sharing, mentoring support, and also joint efforts and partnerships. And in my view, this is where we need to focus more on. This is where the value add of this kind of gathering is important. I'll stop for now. Happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Exley. A masterclass and impressive. You did all of that with very visual notes as well. So, yeah, I think that's very clear. There is a really strong Pacific Way, and a Pacific Way that really is quite world leading as well in terms of this integrated approach, this multi-stakeholder approach as well. So, yeah, I think we're all very much in support to see how we can continue this and make sure that it's really also having impact at the national level. So thank you. And I think you put the kind of the call out for action, you know, is there an Asia Pacific way? Yeah, how do we bring some of these practices and share these learnings from across Asia and Pacific? And maybe this is where I'm going to invite our dear friend, who needs no introduction, Dr. John Hopkins. Can you answer that one for us, Dr. John? Is there an Asia Pacific way?
No, now the astute amongst you may have noticed that I am not the Attorney General of Samoa, who was supposed to be on this panel. And I was, I believe the technical phrase, thrown under the bus by my colleague Finau, who thought I should speak here, so I haven't really had time to prepare a paper. And now, since I've following up our excellent papers, no pressure. Anyway, what I thought I would do is try and sum up what we've already heard already. I'll talk a little bit about this question, and I suppose it's slightly my fault because I did actually set the question of is an Asia Pacific way. So I actually was going to start by saying that I don't actually think there is an Asia Pacific way in the sense of this uber region of the Asia Pacific, but now maybe that's wrong. I certainly think that there is an Asia Pacific way in the sense that we have regional developments that have occurred within this uber region, if you want to call it that, and we've had two of them explored already, and I'll talk about them in a minute. We've also got the SAARC experience, of course, in South Asia. I'm not going to cover that. That's not my area of expertise, but we heard it mentioned yesterday by Gaurika, and then maybe others in the room that want to do that. So there's clearly, there are ways within Asia Pacific, and they are leading and different, and I'll talk about them a little bit. We've already heard them. The other element of this, I think, is what Pratish did, which was talk about, and the way I see it is that maybe sort of localized ways of doing things, that not one size fits all. We need to, I think, get away from the idea that we have international systems, and then they have to be, and at times I think maybe even I've been guilty of this, of sort of imposing a standard across very different states and regions. And we mustn't do that. We must apply different standards and different approaches. So again, I think there is definitely are different approaches across different states within the region that I'll explore in the second part. So what I'm going to do in my few minutes is talk a little bit about regional development and then talk about local development. Talking about regional development more generally, we've heard mention of ASEAN and the Pacific region, but the thing I think that sometimes, it certainly surprised me when I first started researching this, which, probably about a decade ago, was that cooperation in disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management is far less prevalent globally than you might think. So I think as a sort of naive researcher, I assumed this would be an area where states would cooperate quite readily, because it doesn't come with the political problems of economic cooperation or police cooperation, or military cooperation, all those other elements which always come with issues around sovereignty. And I want to assume that cooperating in disasters would be an area that you'd find a lot of cooperation. In fact, you find exactly the opposite. And the reason that I hypothesize, and building on work that were done by other people, is that actually when you get down to it, disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction actually cuts to the heart of what states are about, which is protection and security. Now, often, of course, not from, we're talking about security from natural hazard, but nevertheless, protection and security. And this, you add that to the fact that in many states, particularly in the Asian region, but not only, you'll find this in Europe as well, there's a significant military involvement in DRR and DRM, particularly DRM and response, which, of course, and we see this in New Zealand, where we still refer to our emergency management legal frameworks as civil defence. And that, of course, comes from its establishment in the Second World War. So on the basis of those two, it's at the heart of state power, and therefore states are quite reluctant to cooperate. And that sovereignty element was not, it was too strong for the obvious advantages of cooperation at the regional level to overcome. And those advantages are obvious. And we heard them mentioned yesterday: shared risk. We talked about it with anticipatory action, and in the finance section that we talked about 2 days ago. In fact, we heard it yesterday with the South Asian discussion, cross-border impacts. It's obvious that we should cooperate. But nevertheless, frameworks to actually undertake that were rare. The first, of course, occurs in the South Pacific, called the South Pacific in those days, in the 1960s with the financing arrangements that still exist. But it was something of a false dawn. In fact, there was very little movement regionally until much later, and certainly in this region. And until recently, the leader in the field was, of course, ASEAN. ASEAN set up started off in the 60s, and then but not really dealing with disaster management, very at a low level. And then in the 2000s moves towards adopts a much stronger framework through the ADMER agreement, the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response. But ASEAN's interesting because on the one hand, I think it shows why people have talked about this already. You've really got to get you've got to get into detail if you're going to understand how these frameworks really work. So on the face of it, it's often trumpeted, ADMER, as the most advanced regional disaster risk reduction system. And in one sense it is. It's the only one that I'm aware of, and of course I'll be proved wrong in 30 seconds, that has hard law requirements on states to undertake various aspects. So for example, to develop DRR strategies, to identify risks and communicate them across the partners, to create standard operation procedures on some secondary agreements and quite a wide range of areas and visas and transfer of goods, etc. The problem is, and Ibnu has already alluded to this, and I should say that's Ibnu's paper. He very kindly sticks my name on things, but that's Ibnu's PhD in his paper. But Ibnu has pointed out that in reality, of course, the ASEAN Way means that those hard principles are actually not implemented on the ground. And though some of them are, there's no auditing mechanism, as you mentioned, there's no method to check and ensure, because it's not the way that the ASEAN states undertake their regional model. So it's a success in some ways, but it's a limited success. And the Red Cross, of course, the IFRC has done some good work on this to showing the limits of the ASEAN model, where a number of these practical steps haven't been undertaken. I'm a little bit out of date on the latest stuff, but last time I looked, there were still problems over visas. For example, tourist visas were still mostly used for assistance. The ASEAN is interesting in two levels though, because you have to remember, and Ibnu hinted at this, ASEAN wasn't set up to do what it currently does. ASEAN was set up to stop, of course, 3 minutes, right? ASEAN was set up to stop conflict between the states, which it achieves. And then ADMER and the HA was set up, yes, to encourage cooperation between the states, but as much to stop international intervention overpowering individual state relations during disaster. So they wanted a collective response. So it's become a mediator between the international community, which at times is felt to be and I'm not taking a point as to whether that's correct or not, but overbearing in disaster response, and it allowed a mediator to do that. So the ASEAN model is successful in its own terms, even if we might look at it and think it doesn't actually deliver a lot of what we want. Now, we've heard already in the Pacific, the Pacific examples where we've seen a much more recent move towards Pacific cooperation in disaster risk management and disaster risk reduction, created for different reasons. I'm not going to go on about this. I've written a little bit with Silke Klausing, who's in the audience, so you can explore that. And of course, Exsley knows a lot more than me, so I don't want to say anything that he proves me wrong, so he can prove me wrong. But the points he made that that we now have a single DRR climate change model, as Exsley pointed out, that's a unique example. And I think one of the things I thought was interesting was because it it drives the Pacific's, as I understand it, the Pacific's view of the connection between DRR and climate change, which isn't always so obvious when you go to particularly Western states who still see them as separate things. I think I agree with the Pacific view, but I think the other point is, of course, in the Pacific, it's a different ballgame. So the two things, so just briefly on that point, and then I'll wrap up on the localization point. There are different ways of doing things at the regional level, and they only succeed if there's existing trust between the states. There's little evidence of DRR actually driving cooperation, although we are seeing that now in the Pacific. You've got to have the trust between states first, and that's what the ASEAN model and the Pacific way, I think, has shown. Okay, briefly, just to sum up, Pratish talked about the need to develop local variations and local approaches to disaster risk reduction. I think we've talked about that already. I think that should be super clear, and move away from what Simon Hollis, who works in this field, did his PhD here many years ago, talks about, calls it imagined truths of the international community. But what he meant by that is that we pass these grand international agreements, and then everybody thinks that's wonderful, but of course they don't actually get implemented on the ground. And the Pacific was a clear example of this, because often there were international agreements divided in New York and Geneva, not here, and certainly not in the Pacific Island states. So the relevance was limited. But I think we're seeing a shift, and we need to shift that. I'll finish on a story. So the two examples, I would say, that why we have to do this. If we look at the COVID example, when you talk to the rest of the world, the COVID example was a health emergency, a health disaster. But it wasn't a health disaster for most of the Pacific for most of the time, including here, because of the fact we shut down the borders, we stopped the virus spreading. What we created was a logistics disaster, an economic disaster. Real problem for Pacific Island states, as Exsley hinted at, where you couldn't get supplies, and then of course the PRP stepped in with the humanitarian pathway to deliver those essential supplies. But the rest of the world saw this as a health emergency. For us, it was a logistics problem, a logistics issue, and you need to fit with the demands of the culture and the system that you're operating in. So I'll finish on this little story. So one of the classic examples, and I think it applies here as well as to Pacific Island states, is the heavy use, Pacific Island states, particularly NGOs here, of volunteers and civilians. In New Zealand, just like the Pacific Island states, there's a big culture of community involvement and volunteering. And during the earthquakes, we baked. New Zealand baked and baked and baked. And I still remember on the news us being told to stop baking. So what we need is systems that can utilize the cultural differences of our own states in disaster risk response. Ka kite anō, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, John. We now invite you to put these gentlemen in the hot seat with your questions.
Thank you. And thanks so much for the presentations. It's, again, not an easy start to be the one after the dinner, right? You don't want to be the first panel after we've had dinner. I have two questions. The first one is for Pratish, and the second one is for Exsley. I think you made an excellent couple of points really around the last point around how we need to start seeing disasters as opportunities to kind of bring different people together to solve the problem, as opposed to continue this like fracturing and splintering process of, oh no, I don't believe in what you believe in, so we're not going to work together. But also your point around appreciating, but also leveraging and learning from traditional knowledge structures and governance systems. So my question is around that. Because in Fiji, there is the traditional governance structure, and then there's also a governance structure that was kind of created in parallel by government to mimic the same structure of traditional governance, but managed by government. And I'm just interested to know your thoughts, because I have a bad habit of being incredibly biased and kind of only seeing the negatives of having this kind of parallel system of governance. And I'd be curious to see your thoughts on how this could be a hindrance or a help when trying to ensure that we're doing DRR correctly and in a way that is inclusive. And then my second question for Exsley is around the PRP. As somebody who started work when the PRP was kind of being developed, I again have another bias towards its success, and I'm really kind of always in the champion seat for getting the PRP to be pushed further. But sometimes I feel like I'm met by the reality of it not living up to what I really have envisaged in my mind. So I'm curious what you see as some of the biggest challenges to the furthering of the partnership. And because I don't think it's nice to just talk about the challenges, the second part of the question is, if you had a magic wand and you could fix one thing without any kind of anything holding you back, what would the thing be that you would change to then push further the partnership? Just those little ones. Thanks.
Just those little questions. Okay, so
Thank you, Ernest. I think in the context of Fiji, I think there's a few things that I like to touch on. I think because it has to do a bit with politics, and I think over the 16 or so years that the former government was in charge of, I think involving the community kind of went out the window because Fiji, as you would know, had the Great Council of Chiefs, which historically the government could leverage on to reach out to the grassroots people, especially in the rural communities. And I think over the 16 years, because the GCC was disbanded, I think in terms of at least DRM and probably other initiatives as well, the government, the administrators were unable to reach out to the communities, at least not as much as they would hope to. So that's firstly, there's a political element to it, and secondly, I think now that the GCC is in place in Fiji, for at least as far as I think, at least in Fiji, there is this. Like I know Exley mentioned, there is a Pacific way where people like to get involved. But having taught at the university, I think people in Fiji, at least, and in the Pacific, they also do respect some sort of authority. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the new bill that is the new law that is going to come out in terms of the use of the vote. Instead of using hortatory votes, it's using obligatory votes and actually, probably dictating or mandating the government to take these steps. So I think a combination of that, which mandates the government to come up with initiatives and leveraging on the newly established GCC, I think Fiji could move forward and actually get the community involved in that sense. But having said that, as I did touch on, at least in the Fijian case, I think the NDMO and the subnational offices that are going to be set up, I think they need to be cognizant of the fact that while people in Fiji at least are very communal and they are very much together in terms of responding to disasters, but I think as people get educated and they sort of become independent, and there is a slight shift from you'll notice a slight shift from people moving from those communal settings to urban centers and so forth. Yeah. So I think there needs to be like a balance.
Thank you, Ernest. I think some of the key challenges that I see with the Pacific Resilience Partnership is also linked to the nature of the FRDP. So the FRDP is a voluntary regional framework, and so with that being voluntary, there is no expectation for governments to have strong accountability to that regional framework. And at the same time, it's not directly linked to bringing in financing and funding to countries. It's mainly a platform that brings together those different stakeholders to share voices and experiences, but not directly linked to mobilizing funding and financing. The role of the PRP at the moment, when they convene as a task force that I mentioned, Gabi is a member of that task force. But as someone that doesn't sit in that task force, I have my own observations. So what I see is that whenever that meeting is convened, it's mainly a meeting that comes to discuss and share information. So I think they are not fully leveraging on the role of that task force. And so if the second part of the question, and with that, a lot of governments don't see value in coming to the task force meeting. When there's a task force meeting, you don't see consistent representation from the 5 that was supposed to represent governments. It's mainly just the partners that always stand up in that meeting. If I have the opportunity to improve, I would say that there's need to strengthen the role of the PRP, and that would involve a couple of things. One is leveraging on the fact that there are not many forums or platforms we have in the Pacific that has direct reporting to our Pacific Island Forum leaders. Most other platforms, they might have direct reporting to a ministerial meeting or a senior officials meeting, but not directly to the PIF leaders meeting. That's the apex of policy making in the Pacific. The PRP task force has that direct reporting line to leaders. Every year, there's a standing decision by PIF leaders that the PRP would provide annual progress reports. We are not fully utilizing that opportunity. And this is where I think we need to strengthen that. And by doing this, I see a role for the PRP task force as a mechanism that discusses strategic issues instead of sharing information and just talking about things that are not very important to the region. I also see the role of the PRP involving youth representation. The task force right now doesn't have a youth representative in it. It has CSOs and private sector and partners and governments, but no youth representation in it. And at the same time, I think we need to ensure that countries are actively engaged in that process. So the setup of it is that those 5 from government, they do represent constituencies in the regions, the sub-regions we have. And it is expected that they are to consult within their own constituency groups. They are not doing that. Every time they come, they will only represent their own national interest. And that's the gap we have right now, is how we can support them better so they get the inputs from the constituency groups that they represent in the different sub-regions. I think those are the key things that could be improved to ensure that the PRP fulfills its original intent and rationale for having that.
Thank you. We've got another question up the back there.
Right. Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation, and very inspiring. I think it triggers a lot of questions in my brain. For Pratish, I think your presentation seems to provoke me to ask the question. So how should be a community look like? How should be a community? How should a community be? Because you tend to think that maybe they have to remember the disasters all the time, and suddenly they forgot about it. So how should they remember things? How their memory should be structured in a way that they don't forget the events? Because that's kind of the basic question for community-based approach. But we have we don't go that far to ask questions how communities should remember things and how much portion of bad things like disaster they have to remember and factor into their future. There are a lot of discussion about this in anthropology, probably, the structure of social memory, and the best thing we could imagine is build monuments. But how is that kind of what do you think about it? Because the more you go to conferences, when you talk about community-based, you tend to think about communities should remember all the bad things. I come from Northern Territory where bad things cannot be remembered. It's kind of inviting bad things if you talk about disasters, you know. So there could be different logic to explain why community tend to not mentioning about certain bad things, just in case. And to I think John and probably Ibnu, I agree with the two hypotheses about the objective of ASEAN. The first thing is that at least you don't have war. Yeah, so security and protection is kind of the highest objective, the ASEAN pillar number one. But to argue that they strategically pull the strategy for ADMER to become like a facilitator to accept international aid, I think it's kind of ex ante in interpretation rather than something planned in advance. Because the only example is just that this could be demonstrated is based on, I think, Nargis 2008 and then probably 2018 earthquakes in Sulawesi. Now, I've been working with ASEAN colleagues, especially I've been training officials for the last 4 or 5 years, and I ask in the beginning, I always ask one simple question: what is your dream? Because I was motivated by the question whether government can dream. My experiments with Indonesian officials for the last since 2017 is most of the time governments cannot dream. The best way you could push is they will remember the blueprints that they have been preparing. But there was one interesting response last year, where in the ASEAN, one of the we are developing this ASEAN framework, the certification for professionals. So NDMOs came to participate, and I asked this simple question: what is your dream? And I was surprised to see that there was a response from ASEAN colleagues to think that maybe the practice is already better than the dream. Because they are dreaming that if one country is suffer from disaster, the other country will come and help. So this kind of imagined communities is kind of somehow exists. Something that is not yet there, but there are statistics that the ASEAN colleagues provided that the reality is already better than the dream. So I was interested in the imagined truth that you shared from the previous PhD student. My question is that I noticed that there is a kind of beautiful transition all the time from the Pacific and also, I mean, in the Pacific and also in ASEAN, where you have this, I think, Pratish, you mentioned about people get educated, and as they get educated, they kind of transition from traditional to be kind of modern. I think in legal pluralism studies, they have been using this kind of what you call that territorialization of things, where you have many overlapping rules and regulations that the players or the communities will select what rules or law they will select, because you have probably 4 to 5 different framework operating at the same time, and it's really up to the communities to think about that. And the last thing for Exsley is, how is the China factor being played in the Pacific, and what do you see? Because I think it could be an interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you. So many different issues in that one. I hope all the speakers got the issues that they need to respond to. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think it's one of the things that I was thinking of myself is you can involve the community, but how do you constantly remind the community of the obligations? Because somehow people just don't value their life if they don't realize that if they are not prepared, if they don't respond, they could literally lose their lives. So, and as I was preparing for the presentation, as I alluded to in my presentation, I was reflecting on uh, at my time at uh, at the BSP Life, which is a insurance company in Fiji, and it's the banking industry in Fiji, and I think Leonard would agree that it's heavily regulated, and every 2 or 3 months, I think we had to do a obligations register and send compliance reports. And I used to do the same thing at the university as well, and that was actually one of my favorite jobs because because you get to benchmark your practices to the laws that are in place. Anyway, so I think if in Fiji for at least if there was some sort of, I wouldn't say OBS register, but maybe get the community involved, get them to decide how exactly they would like to update, because the ultimate aim, of course, is to keep reminding them that they need to be prepared for disasters and they need to reduce the risks of disasters. And I think I know it sounds as if it's going to happen like in just 1 year or so, but it is a process and it's a slow process, and I and I'm hopeful that it can happen because as an educator, I remember that in my class I had this. I used to give a point each to the student if they were able to recall what we did in the entire class. So just before the class ended, we used to go around the room, and if they were able to just come up with a sentence of what happened in the class, and of course if there's 10 students, even if 7 students got it right, it gave me hope that at least maybe in the next class they would be able to, the number would increase. And I think that same thing could be applied in the communities in other aspects as well. Yeah, so I am hopeful it can happen.
Yeah, no, isn't it one of,
Oh, you want me? Like, okay, I'll be brief. I would just say that I never have as much hope as Pratish. If I have 10 people in my class, if 2 of them have any idea what happened in the class, that's a win. Anyway, sorry, so I should have been clear about the role of ADMIR, and particularly the HA and how it's developed and the political thing behind. So that's not my idea. That's from ASEAN scholars, political scholars, who argued that at the political level, one of the things that's driven the success of ADMIR and HA has actually been a desire to keep some international partners at not arm's length, but to manage it. So, but that's not to say that those at the coalface, as it were, I think and those working in practice, and in fact, we've had some I've studied here from the HA, have a different view, and they are more, more working as DRR practitioners, DRM practitioners, excuse me, and wanting to see cooperation on the ground. And I think you're right. There is, again, that reality may be different from the legal frameworks. But somebody said it the other day. I mean, I still think the problem is if you're just relying on reality and often on personal relationships, that's risky because those people change and those people move, and what you want something is in place that will last the people moving. So yes, sorry, I didn't want to say that was the only driver behind the HA, but certainly political studies academics think it's part of the reason for the politicians going down the path, despite the fact that ASEAN, of course, is quite tricky, and the ASEAN Way makes it difficult for them to cooperate in these areas.
Thank you. I have the difficult question to reflect on China's role in the Pacific, and I would say that as governments, they have the discretion to make sovereign decisions, and certainly there is renewed geopolitical interest in the Pacific Islands region at the moment from different partners, both our traditional development partners and also new partners. So as those new partners start to engage more actively with our countries in the region, that level of engagement at the moment is mainly at the bilateral level. At the regional level, we don't have any agreed regional position on China's role when it comes to DRR or DRM at this stage. But certainly at the bilateral level, those arrangements and responsibilities are certainly there with countries that have bilateral arrangements. But I think one thing that we've started to see now is the growing interest from the geopolitical players on our region as of recently. And I would also say that as practitioners and those of us that work in this space, we have a duty. Although we cannot influence what governments do, sometimes that also includes the way that legislations and policy frameworks are developed. Sometimes we continue to advocate for certain things to be included, but they might not be included because the decision-making process is at a different level beyond all of us in this room. We have to find a way to elevate and anchor what we want to be there in the current situation that we are in. And so regardless of whoever and whichever partner is there in a particular region and whatever legislative context that they have, our role is to find how we can find an entry point in that scheme of things to anchor what we want to see. Because we might not directly influence it, but we'll find somewhere that we can anchor or find an entry point that we put what we want somewhere there so that maybe eventually it will help to influence some of these decisions in the future. So that's my viewpoint on that particular issue. But most of our countries adopt a friends to all, enemy to none approach. So we certainly welcome different players coming in. But as I said, no regionally agreed position on that particular partner's role when it comes to DRM in the Pacific.
Okay, we have, somebody's already got the mic. So maybe 2 more questions, yeah? And then I encourage everyone else to ask your questions over the coffee breaks.
Thank you. My apologies. I just walked in, but I was listening to the session on the bus on my way down. So I just want to add on a bit, a small comment from a private sector perspective, the approaches towards DRR. And I heard Ashley talk about the challenges and also Pratish in the context of Fiji. I heard the word GCC and so forth and the changes. There's a lot of challenges, definitely. I mean, private sector does not work alone in this space. It works with all the relevant partners in the government and all the different stakeholders out there. The approach that the private sector has taken across is, I'll probably share an example, like when we gathered all the private sector entities together to try and form this Disaster Resilience Council, one of the key challenges faced was, what is it in there for me? That's a question posed by the private sectors. They always come up and say, look, how am I going to make a margin? How am I going to make a profit? What we did was took the approach of saying, look, it's not in it for you. It's in it for the wider community. It's a holistic approach that we are reaching out to the community. And for example, getting 5 or 6 major hardware suppliers into an organization who are competitors at the same time, we said, why don't you sell your product at your cost price and do not make a margin of it? And, this will, in the way you will still get your margin out and you'll accept. So the question that we pose there is, in terms of having that approach, is trying to make sure that there was a continuity of support provided by the private sector in terms of mitigating disaster risk with the communities. And at the end of the day, we wanted to make sure that someone takes responsibility and take ownership of that process, right? And with the changes that's happening in all the different institutes, that has been a challenge, an ongoing challenge. So when we pass back that accountability aspect to the community or to the relevant stakeholder, we saw that a lot of changes were taken place, right? And there's a lot of examples in Fiji, for example, out in the Azores, where it's a community-driven initiative, right? Started off through with the private sector, support by the development partners. Now the community is taking that forward and continuously enhancing, coming up with the different changes that are required to be embedded to make sure that the preparedness and the mitigation aspects are always going. So that has been done in different niche areas within the Pacific. So private sector continue to support that at different engagement. Mostly they do it at their own accord, apart from, where the support comes in. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to hold that thought on private sector reflections. We're going to go up the back of the room to Madam Finau for her question. Oh, and then we'll go down. We're going to collect a couple and then down to Mr. Marco.
Malolele. Thanks so much. I'll just get straight into my question. And I think it's really for Ibnu and possibly everyone else. And it was just my reflection on the ASEAN Way. So for example, at the IFRC, we're very keen on peer exchanges, and we had a peer exchange between the Pacific and the Caribbean to look at how they respond to regional to disasters as a region. And I was surprised when we went there that SEDIMA, which is basically the meeting of all of their disaster management officials, they actually have a day where they sit together with Red Cross, their National Red Cross, and they plan out how they're going to tackle things. We've got the PRP example, again, where it's incredibly diverse in their inclusion of all of these different partners and stakeholders. So it's not just government, but you've also got a whole variety. And then we went to Indonesia to visit the AHA Centre and also ASEAN. And I think that's the biggest thing that struck me was the lack of anyone else apart from governments. And I remember when we gave a presentation on the PRP, it was still in the works, it hadn't been passed or anything. They were literally mortified that we would share power, or that we would choose to or that governments would willingly choose to share power. So I know that they've got so many frameworks out there. There's an ASEAN Anticipatory Action Framework. There's all of these frameworks that have huge impact, of course, on communities. And I just wondered, where are those entry points within the ASEAN Way for those alternative voices or those other voices to come into the decision-making process, if there are any? And so that's the bulk of my question. Cheers.
Thank you. Now down a couple of seats. Marco, we'll collect your question as we're coming down.
See, mine would be a small comment, so maybe better to have the time for the reply to the question, and then let's see if I make my comment now or later. I prefer to give the time to the reply. Then.
Oh. Okay, so we have two, yeah? Maybe who wants to take the private sector reflection? Oh, okay, okay. No.
Okay, thank you for the question. So, it's a difficult question actually. Yeah, it's in ASEAN. It's very difficult for community or local people to just get involved in decision making in any ASEAN like initiative. Yeah, so that's the thing, and that's because not only that ASEAN is controlling. They want to control. It's not saying that they want to control everything, but that's also the community don't really care. We can say that, right? Like for example, in Indonesia, the AHA Center is successful in some cases. They do come to help when when the tsunami happened in 2004, for example, right? Or when the cyclone happened in Vietnam or something. But when it comes, my presentation is specifically for haze, but for pollution, if you see the AHA Center list of what of their activity from 2012, there's never been they're never involved in any haze pollution disaster, and they've never been involved, and I don't know what happened. I don't know why. Why is it so difficult? Because maybe if it's earthquake and everyone can get involved because you can see the impact straight away, right? Or if it's tsunami, you can see the impact like in Aceh. So they come and help. But when it's haze, the impact is there, but maybe it's 5 to 10 years after. So they don't really care. So, to answer your question, where can the community get involved in this decision making, or how can they get involved? It's difficult. Everything is the bureaucracy is difficult. Yeah, maybe that's what you see when you come to ASEAN. ASEAN is in Jakarta, right? And ASEAN and they smell all the pollution every year, but they don't do it. They don't do anything. See, and they're not inviting other people to come because like I said in my presentation, the one of the Indonesia is the biggest producer of palm oil. They don't want anyone, if they let anyone come, the AHA Center come to help the situation in forest fire, then they know what happened. Because I work in the private sector before, and I know what happened. I know what started the fire. So they don't want to know this. They want to, because all these are projects. If they have funding from other countries, that's the project for them. They don't want to share it. That's
I guess the private sector intervention was more of a comment in regards to the approach that's taken now in Fiji. And certainly, yeah, I think we all know businesses, it's about how my involvement will bring revenue and help in building my profit and so forth. And it's good that, I mean, the businesses in Fiji are taking that approach instead of expecting what to receive out of their engagement. They're looking at what their contribution is achieving and helping to get to. And I think that's the kind of messaging that we should encourage in all regions that we come from, to ensure that we move in that direction, that people feel a sense of ownership of their responsibilities and what they could contribute when we go through disasters and events that our countries endure. So I don't have anything further to add, but just to say that may be the kind of approach that we should encourage in all our regions.
Okay. Marco.
Maybe, thank you, Gabi. Maybe just a couple of reflections on the private sector and on the community. On the community, on how to remember, I'm not sure there is like a straightforward reply, precisely because of the social and cultural context that we have said. However, I'm just coming from Japan, and I was quite impressed by the fact that 6 months after, actually less than 6 months after the earthquake in Noto, in the north of the country, they have already done, they're working hard on a lessons learned type of thing. So in a way, there has to be an immediate engagement of the community in getting their feedback of what has or what has not happened, and then a way to institutionalize that feedback back into legislative processes, revision of building codes, and so on and so forth. And there are practical effects. I mean, we visited an area where one was completely flattened, and a few hundred meters away, the buildings were standing simply because they were built in accordance to this feedback created from a past earthquake. So that's, I think, is an important way. And I was struck by the fact that the authorities were placing a lot of attention, I shared that with some of you, on the social recovery. So the social element is something that must be captured almost like immediately in the aftermath of a disaster, together with the understanding of more technical issues and so on and so forth. I think that is an important component, both for the healing, but also for the remembering of what needs to be done next, and a way to initiate a number of formal processes that can lead to revision of legislation, revisions of codes, whatever it takes. On the private sector, and I apologize because I should have mentioned yesterday, one of the big findings of the midterm review of the Sendai framework is that the private sector still does not see disaster risk reduction as their business. There is a huge expectation, and we have to be honest, even ourselves, when something happens, we instinctively look at the governments to provide some support. It's like the almost social contract coming from Rousseau times. So that's the expectation that the private sector has. And we know that at the same time, the private sector in most countries is responsible for 70 to 80% at least investments. And we know for a fact that whenever you make an investment, there are only two outcomes. Either you reduce disaster risk or you increase disaster risk. There is no third options there. So what is happening is really working with the private sector to go actually, a lot of private sector still does not have business continuity plans, and that is bad in and of itself because it has an impact on the national treasury, because the less you are prepared, the more you expect the states, but that the states take action on the basis of public money and tax revenues and all of that. And there is good movement on the social corporate responsibility, but yet those two, meaning a business continuity plan and social corporate responsibility, is not what creates an environment for prevention and reduction of risk. So that is what we are actually working on. And the best way to do that is to work with enlightened business people, which are out there, luckily, that are precisely seeing the business case for disaster risk reduction, that there is a return on investment. And it is with them that you can bring more and more people on that table. So that is the only recipe at the moment that seems to be working, rather than the UN or others talk to the business sector. It's really business to business way of working. But yeah, I think it's an unfair expectations on the governments to say that the government needs to take care. It's simply impossible. If we all know that if we misbehave, the only option that the government has is kind of trying to retrofit what we have done. That this doesn't work. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those reflections, Marco, and great to see that we're also passionate still about the issues on our third day of the conference, that we've run 15 minutes into our coffee break. Just join with me again. I think, it was a really dynamic panel. Thanks to all our panelists. I think that, there's consensus that, regional approaches are good, and I think, we can certainly see the trajectory getting more and more in terms of regional, sub-regional approaches. We have lots of good examples, at least on paper, of some wonderful frameworks. I think both in ASEAN and Pacific also pointed to issues in terms of implementation, the financing, the engagement. I think, that was a really good discussion at the end, saying, it is everybody's business, and everyone has really got to get involved as well in terms of implementation of the frameworks and support of it. But let's not lose sight that where we have the biggest impact is going to be at this national level, and how we bring this all down to make sense with our national counterparts in our communities. So please join with me, hands together. Woo!